Welcome to the Science for Sport podcast, where we dive into stories and insights that drive peak performance. Join us as we uncover the secrets behind the science of success. Here's your host, Richard Graves.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Science for Sport podcast with me, Richard Graves. This week's guest is Dr. Sam Scott. He has a PhD in exercise physiology and has focused his research on helping people overcome type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Previously, he was the head of research on the Team Novo Nordisk pro cycling team, the world's first all-diabetes pro cycling team. And he's currently an advisor on the exercise physiology interest group leadership team to the American Diabetes Association. So, let's hear from him now.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Well, Dr. Sam Scott, we're delighted you've taken the time to join us on this week's show. For those that perhaps aren't familiar with you or your work, what is your background?
Thanks for having me, Richard. So I'm an exercise physiologist. My background is predominantly in diabetes and exercise. It's largely been split around the technology that people use to monitor glucose, exercise wearables, and also clinical research.
For regular listeners of this podcast, early this year they'll have heard our chat with Braden Narveson, a professional kicker in the NFL, and his experience of growing up and living and playing professional sport with diabetes. Now, he's a type 1 diabetic. Obviously, you've done a lot of research in this field. For those that aren't familiar with the condition, what's the biggest difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, absolutely. So type 1 diabetes affects around 9 million people worldwide. It's an autoimmune condition where for some reason that we don't quite understand at the moment, whether it's genetically linked, environmentally linked, your body starts attacking its own beta cells. These are the cells that make a hormone called insulin. Type 2 diabetes affects almost 600 million people worldwide. It's much more common. This is a condition which is largely lifestyle related in terms of physical inactivity. It's also got strong components with nutrition. There are very strong genetic components there as well. This is where your body stops responding so well to insulin, eventually stops producing its own, and then you need other kind of medications to manage your glucose moving forward.
So if you want to play sport at the highest level then, and you do suffer with either condition, what are the biggest challenges an individual will face?
So with type 1 diabetes, yeah, it's absolutely possible to compete at the highest level, as you mentioned. American football, we've been working with rugby players at the highest level, professional cyclists, runners. I've met people who've been to the top of Everest living with type 1 diabetes. But it's really, really difficult. Basically, with type 1 diabetes, you've got to take over the job of managing glucose. So rather than relying on your body to do this, which if you don't have diabetes, you just take completely for granted, you've got to do a combination of monitoring what your glucose is doing at certain times of the day, self-administering insulin to cover the carbohydrates that you're consuming, and exercise adds in all kinds of complexities around risk of hypoglycemia, so it's dangerously low blood glucose, and other complexities around fueling, taking in enough energy for the sport, additional logistical challenges around knowing what your glucose is doing if you're in combat sports or sports where you just can't see your glucose. So it's really complicated.
When we spoke to Braden Narveson, he spoke to us about wearing an Omnipod, which obviously monitors the levels in his body. And as a professional athlete, he'll have a whole team supplied by the organisation around him to ensure that he's as healthy as he possibly can be. Obviously, to the everyday amateur sportsman and woman, those facilities aren't always going to be accessible or available. So if you do suffer with that condition, what's your advice, and how can you go about ensuring that you're able to enjoy the best possible lifestyle that you can?
Well, it will really depend, yeah, as you say, on what type of technology that you're able to get access to, also what you find comfortable using, what's the most suitable for the type of sport that you're using. So what he'll have been using is, it's an Omnipod pump, which is basically a tubeless pump. The majority of insulin pumps have a catheter, which is kind of a tube. This can be inconvenient for many sports, particularly contact sports, because you have the risk of this being pulled away. So this is most likely why he finds it useful for him. The other thing that he has, where he's very lucky as well, I've listened to the episode where he has it so that his Omnipod pump is able to communicate with the glucose monitor. There's an algorithm which is able to automatically adjust the insulin that's coming in. Obviously, this is something that not everybody has access to. It'll also depend on personal preference. I've spoken to a lot of athletes who don't like using the pump systems for various reasons, whether it's that they don't like having something that's physically attached to their body. They might therefore choose to use insulin pens, which involves using injections. This is something that's more kind of flexible in that you're able to not, as I say, have something attached to your body. Many people might not have access to certain types of technology on their health insurance. There might be other logistical challenges around the risk of a malfunction. So some of the athletes I've worked with have said that they would love to use a pump system, but if they're traveling on the other side of the world, there's a malfunction, then they don't have a backup. So therefore they prefer using the pens just so that they have more control. It's easier to adapt should something go wrong. So it's really about kind of what works best for you, the level of additional support you have within the team who can help you if something malfunctions, get your settings right on whatever you're using. And then also the constraints of the actual sport itself. Some sports, they don't allow you to have anything attached to your body while you're competing.
Now, I want to focus on your work with professional athletes in a pro sports environment shortly, but many of us, going back to when we were kids, will have known a friend, a family member that was a diabetic, and will have all been involved in a situation where you'll have heard someone say they feel a bit lightheaded, and the remedy was have some chocolate, have something with sugar in. Obviously, technology, research have all advanced incredibly in the intervening period. So when we're relating to the everyday layman, what's your advice from your research, your experience, and what you know about the condition?
Yeah, so a lot has changed since I started working in this area. I've been working in this area around 10 years now. It's important to kind of put out there as well, I don't live with type 1 diabetes myself, but my passion in this area is really through working and building up friendships with people who are living with type 1 diabetes. And the thing that really struck me when I first started was a big sense of feeling very alone. Living with the condition was extremely common. Oftentimes people would say that they didn't know anybody else who was living with type 1 diabetes. There weren't too many examples of other people who were competing at high levels in various sports. Nowadays you see lots of communities, sports groups. There are lots of examples where people have competed in a whole range of sports and been able to share what they've done. And I think that this is really, really powerful. As I say, there's large community groups. There's examples of people really competing and winning at the top of pretty much every single sport that you can have. And I think this makes a big difference in terms of people being able to feel that a diagnosis with type 1 diabetes, yes, it's going to make things difficult, but there are other people who live with the condition as well. It is possible to continue doing whatever you want to do, whether it's sports or academic or your professional ambitions. It's just that you have to develop strategies to manage this alongside. And as well, technology treatments, this has all improved vastly.
Yeah, absolutely it has. And it helps if you're somebody who lives with type 1 or type 2 diabetes to be able to see somebody that's living their life to the full, playing sport at the highest level as a role model. And obviously in Great Britain, Sir Stephen Redgrave for many, many years was that person winning multiple Olympic gold medals in rowing. Now, we all know that to compete in that particular sphere at that level, it's about looking after your body, it's about nutrition. Obviously, having diabetes then factors in an added complication to ensuring that you're able to compete effectively. You've worked with Team Novo Nordisk in your career as head of research for them, the world's first all-diabetes pro cycling team. How difficult was that, living in an environment where they're finely tuned athletes? Every 0.1% matters, and you're doing it with a team of athletes who all live with a condition that add a complicated factor to ensuring that you do have the right balance of nutrition, you do have the right sugar levels, the right fluids as well. Cycling isn't an easy environment to operate in the first place. Throw in diabetes, that makes your job, I imagine, an awful lot tougher.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I was lucky enough to experience that. It was incredibly interesting. And cycling is kind of the ultimate sport, I would say, in terms of sports science and the way in which, if you don't live with diabetes, the fine-tuning of nutrition, recovery practices, your even your tactics, the way that you are needing to get your recovery and sleep, your travel logistics right is so important. There are sports where you can be a little bit more relaxed, let's say the night before or the day before competing in an event, but with cycling there's absolutely no room for that. And if you add on type 1 diabetes, which I think is really one of the most complex and demanding conditions, in that almost every decision you make, whether it's stress related, whether it's nutrition related, recovery, you lose sleep, it's all going to have an impact on your blood glucose levels. You add the two together and you've really at least doubled the complexity and challenges there. So these were athletes that were competing at a very, very high level against the top athletes who don't have type 1 diabetes. I think we could talk about this for a really, really long time, and you could go into individual aspects of their daily life and competition. But even if you take like preparations going into the race day, for an athlete who doesn't have diabetes, you're really able to take so many factors for granted around fueling. It's all around just making sure you get in adequate food for fuel alone. But if you have type 1 diabetes, the dual challenge of fueling, making sure that your blood glucose levels remain within the range that you're aiming for, because if you experience hypoglycemia in the lead up to a race, you're just not going to be in a space to compete. But if your glucose levels are very high, you're going to struggle to be able to take on the fuel that you want. You're also likely to need to correct with additional insulin, which is then going to lead to a condition of increased risk of hypoglycemia during the race. There's all of these complexities. You could name any point another thing that we were noticing just quickly, probably the first thing that we noticed was that these athletes are not just waking up in their bed and going for a cycle ride. They're waking up in a different hotel room every single night. It's like living in a circus whereby you wake up, pack, make sure you're ready to move to the next place. Logistically, it's so challenging. And over the course of a race, you're cycling hundreds of kilometers day after day, and you're having to make sure that as soon as day one is finished, your recovery is perfect so that you can be ready the following day to compete. And we were seeing that throughout a race, on average, the athletes were experiencing hypoglycemia during the night, which was suggesting that aside from the fact that it's dangerous, they're not recovering as well as they should be, they're kind of not going to be in the place where they're going to be kind of on an equal footing compared to the athletes who don't have diabetes. So these are things where if you don't have the condition, your priority is just taking in as much fuel as possible, getting your massage, that kind of thing. But these athletes, it just never stopped.
As head of research then in that environment, how challenging did you find that role? Because as a scientist, you're used to being able to have a test sample. Well, you've just explained there that living in that environment, that there are no set parameters. It changes hour by hour, day by day. So how big a challenge was that for you?
Yeah, so when I was working in that environment, I was simultaneously working in a hospital doing clinical research. My work there was all around having everything controlled in terms of like making sure that what people have eaten was exactly the same. You're avoiding all variables that influence your results. With the team, it was extremely difficult in that you're trying to learn and implement different things while not interfering with the current practices of the team. You're trying to implement changes that are not going to interfere as well with normal blood glucose management. Also that you're being kind of respectful of each individual's athlete's willingness to take part in a scientific experiment. Before going into this environment, they've not signed up to be a research subject. They've signed up to be an athlete. So you have to get them on board. You have to get them to trust you. You have to realize that they've found something that works for them around their diabetes management training that they may not want to change because it's going to have a big impact on their health and their athletic performance, which is important for their whole lifestyle. So you've got to very slowly kind of build the trust, work out the best way to start implementing things in a way that's going to have a positive impact. The other thing that we were very keen to do here when we started this work was not implement changes too quickly because they were obviously doing something right. So rather than changing things or introducing new measures, we wanted to find out what was going well and why different athletes were doing certain things the way they were doing it.
Out of that experience then, Sam, what did you find most inspirational, be it the recollection of a particular instance or working with an athlete? What springs to mind?
There's lots of things. I think that what really stands out for me is the individual as the athlete. I still think that there's a long way to go to helping people living with type 1 diabetes to implement various kind of strategies or help them to use the latest technology, because
it's important to emphasize that technology is progressing all the time as well, isn't it?
It's progressing all the time, absolutely, but it's also it's difficult for there's one thing doing it in the lab in a controlled setting, and there's another thing towards implementing that into your lifestyle, especially when you've got professional sports. So I think that it really stands out to me still how much individual trial and error there is. I think that a lot of people living with type 1 diabetes still have to do the majority of the work themselves, and on a case-by-case basis, having to go through so many kind of setbacks individually. And if you think of how an athlete who doesn't have type 1 diabetes wouldn't have those additional decisions, hurdles to have had to overcome, experimenting with new technologies that come out, having to deal with setbacks around days that you just can't explain related to glucose management and just your general well-being, then that really stands out, and that's really impressive.
What would you say the benefits are of staying active, particularly for people with diabetes? Because I imagine that there'll be some that say, look, I have this condition, I just can't do what everybody else does. That's not the case though, is it?
Yeah, so if we take type 1 diabetes, this is a big problem. So people who manage to stay active, have exercise in their life as a regular thing, will usually say that exercise is so important to their glucose management. They don't know how they would manage their diabetes without it, because it's such a great tool towards management. Exercise helps with insulin sensitivity, it helps with general well-being. There's also the community aspect, the psychological aspect. But oftentimes when people are first diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, there's very little support that's first given around exercise. The majority of clinicians don't do much training around exercise. They don't have tools to help them, to help their patients to understand exercise. And so as a consequence, somebody who was previously active usually stops doing exercise when they're first diagnosed. Generally, people are kind of advised, okay, stop exercising for the time being, let's settle everything else, then we can look towards introducing it. And this is really a shame, because it can help a lot with managing glucose and just generally sort of having sport, which is such an important part of so many people's lives. So there's a big amount of work which is needed towards helping with the confidence, helping with the support that's given around exercise. That's just type 1 diabetes. Yeah.
And going forward, given all your learnings and the research as well, what do you see the trends being in the future, the tools that are going to be available in order to help with this condition?
So the really big thing in recent years has been continuous glucose monitors. So traditionally, managing glucose meant taking regular blood samples 10, 12, 15 times a day, oftentimes. The problem that you have here is you just have individual data points, and then you have to make a decision off that. You have no information about the direction in which your glucose is going. Also, you have no way in which to like self-reflect on the data unless you're very, very vigilant in keeping a note. So it's difficult to analyze that, to make retrospective action on your lifestyle, your insulin dosing. So continuous glucose monitoring allows people to see pretty much in real time, there's a slight delay, but pretty much real time, a continuous reading of their glucose, so that they can see what their glucose is trending, so they can see what is going to happen to their glucose in the next 10 or 15 minutes. And it also allows them to retrospectively analyze this alone or with their doctor, so that they can better manage this. I do think though, and this is where a lot of my work comes in, is that the problem with this is there's a lot of data and you're putting this in front of people, but the contextualization around this, especially when it comes to sport, and understanding how exercise influences the direction and the general impact on glucose is lacking. So I think moving forward, we really need to have this kind of easy way to understand this type of exercise will influence my glucose in this way.
How positive are you about the direction of travel as relates to diabetes research and, if not finding a cure, finding a way that people who suffer with this condition, both type 1 and type 2, can better manage their everyday lives?
Well, yeah, still focusing on type 1 diabetes predominantly, but we can talk about type 2 diabetes as well. But with type 1 diabetes, I'm very, very positive. It's kind of, I still want to be very kind of conscious of the fact that there are people living with this on an everyday situation. So I don't want to minimize the fact that it's still extremely difficult and it's still extremely challenging. And there are many people who are not getting access to either the care, the time with their healthcare professional, or the technical support that they should have access to. But if you take like a big picture approach and you see the improvements in continuous glucose monitors, the insulin pump technology, the automated insulin device technology. So these are devices where you're automatically regulating your insulin levels without having to have input from the individual with diabetes themselves. There's huge advances there. Also, going back to that kind of support thing as well, people are continually able to find other people living with the condition, find support, find people who are located near to them, interested in a similar sport to them, living with diabetes as well, that they can learn from. This is something where people no longer have to feel as though they're the only person in the world who's having to regularly inject themselves and manage their glucose in this way. So there's big improvements. I also know that there's huge advances going on outside my kind of area in terms of testing for screening, identifying people who are at increased risk so that treatment can be put in place much sooner. There's also big advances going in terms of cure. I've seen very positive things in this space. In terms of type 2 diabetes, it's again really mixed here. On one hand, if you look at the statistics, the number of people who are living with pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes is really exploding, particularly in developing countries where you're seeing an increased level of industrialization, fewer people working in manual jobs, moving to office-based jobs, moving towards more processed types of food. This is an enormous problem which has got to have a different set of solutions, which will involve...
Yeah, again, it comes back to nutrition and diet as well, doesn't it?
Exactly. So improving the kind of societal infrastructure in terms of access to good quality food, access to outdoor spaces and the time to do exercise, having that put into people's lives, that makes sense. Education as well. So there's a huge amount of work that's needed on that side.
Well, Sam, unbelievably, we're out of time already. I've found this an incredibly informative chat. I would love to have you back on the show at some time in the future to explore this subject a little bit more. For those people that are now hooked by what you've had to say and are keen to find out more, where can they follow you and find out some more?
Yeah, so you can find me by searching for What I'm working on at the moment is my company is called Enhanced, so Enhance-D. This is a digital solution around diabetes and sports. So you can find my contact details on there. Please reach out if you're interested in this. I always try and answer questions, and we're looking for people to try out the solution as well.
Thanks for your time, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Many thanks to Dr. Sam Scott for taking the time to join us on this week's podcast, sharing valuable insights into the conditions of type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And if you want to find out more about the topics we've discussed, you can do so by visiting our website, www.scienceforsport.com. And if you have enjoyed this week's show, then please do feel free to share it with a coach, a colleague, an athlete or a friend. Remember, the more downloads we get, the easier it becomes for us to attract top-name athletes or experts leading their field. Well, that's just about all from me for this week's show. I look forward to the next time we can all sit down and talk some more on the next edition of the Science for Sport podcast.
Subscribe to the Science for Sport podcast now, wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more insights, resources, and to join the Academy, visit scienceforsport.com and connect with us on social media by searching for @ScienceForSport. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.